Let's start with our first speaker. 3 years ago, when we were organizing a national event in Turkey named UX Turkey, he was the first name that we wanted to invite. But unfortunately, because of his schedule, he was not able to attend. However, he was so kind to send us a signed copy of his book, Simple and Usable. We are honored to welcome Giles Colborne.
Thank you. What a fantastic venue. This story begins a couple of years ago when a client asked me this question: how can we delight our customers? And you know what? We'll pay you to tell us. Now that scared me. Not just because I'm English and so I'm a little bit afraid of emotions, but also because delight, that's a big word. Not satisfy our customers, but delight them. And how do you guarantee you're going to leave people feeling like that? And also, what's the value of that to my client? I mean, I know that I can go to their store, I can fix the checkout process, and I can make them more money. What's the value to a company of leaving people delighted? How do you measure that? So I wanted two things. I wanted some design rules that I knew were going to guarantee that we could delight people. And I wanted a way of measuring the value of delight to that business. So I began by looking around at what designers said were delightful experiences to see if I could find some patterns, something I could make those rules from. Let me show you what I found. One design blog gathered together all of the most delightful designs from the year. And one of them was this. It said, this was a delightful website. It looks like an ordinary website, but when you click on the navigation at the top, sploosh, you end up in a pint of beer. And for beer drinkers, this is a delightful experience. So, okay. What else? Another website was pulled up by somebody I admire as a delightful experience, and it looks like an ordinary photo website, except there was this hidden feature where you could click on the forward and back keys, and that would move you backwards and forwards through the photos. And at the time, that was really unusual, and that little touch was a delightful touch. This one went through our office like wildfire when it first came out. So if you go onto Google Chrome and you open a website and the security certificate isn't valid, you get a little skull and crossbones up in the top of the browser. And people in our office thought that was fantastic. Delightful experience. So what all these things have in common? Oh, I beg your pardon, here's another one. Banks. The marketing department in banks are always afraid that people will find banks boring, right? So this bank decided to create what they call the Little Black Book. And it's a section on the website where customers can go and they can share recommendations for delightful restaurants and places to eat. And so what have we got? Well, we've got delight is something that's surprising, or hidden touches, or attention to detail, or associating yourself with something else that's delightful. But I think all of these things have one thing in common, and that is they're all a bit lame. They're not really very delightful, are they? One of the guys from our office went home and he told his wife about that skull and crossbones thing, and she was like, so what? So the designers don't have a very convincing idea of what's delightful. I decided I'd go and ask real people. And it gets even worse. I beg your pardon. It gets even worse when you ask the designers, well, what's the value of delight? So this is a blog I was reading at the time, and it was written by people I really admire, and it was full of great advice. But when it came to the value of delight, this is what they had to say. It's hard to prove the ROI, hard to prove the value of a small moment of delight in a design which requires a little extra time and attention, which means money, right? Although I do believe you'll see a negative ROI when delight doesn't happen. That doesn't even mean anything. So they're not really very good examples of delight. They cost money, and we're not sure what the value is. So, as I said, I started to ask real people about their experience of delight. And I asked them this question. And it's a question I've been asking ever since, because the answers were so surprising and useful. When did a product or service delight you? Now, at the time, I spoke to about 30 people. And the stories they told me were very different from the stories of delight that designers told. One person told me about booking airline tickets for a budget airline. He said, it was late at night, I was just about to go to bed, I hit the buy button on my computer, and it hung, stopped working. So it was late. I shut my laptop down, went to bed, woke up the next morning, went back on the website, booked the tickets, checked my email, 2 sets of tickets bought. This is a budget airline, okay? So he said, I called the airline, he said, and I was ready for a fight. The woman on the end of the line said, yeah, you did book 2 sets of tickets. Uh-oh. And the tickets you booked in the morning were more expensive than the ones you booked the night before. Uh-oh. So I'll refund the ones that were more expensive, and you can keep the ones that you wanted in the first place. He said, I was delighted. This was the best experience I've ever had online. That's weird. Here's another example. This is, the kind of box you get when you change internet service provider. You get a box like this sent to you, and you also get a little slip of paper with all the numbers you've got to type into your computer, and you type them into your computer, and then it loads them onto the box, and then it doesn't work, and then you spend the rest of the morning on the telephone to technical support. The person telling me about this experience said the company realized that if they knew the numbers well enough to print them on a piece of paper, then they knew the numbers well enough to program them into the box before they sent it to me. And that's what they did. So I opened the box up, I plugged it in, and it just worked. Delight. There's a pattern here, and it was a pattern that was repeated throughout the stories that I picked up. You've got some moment of anxiety, resolved effortlessly, leading to delight. That's a really strong pattern. There are little variations of that. Somebody told me about using Nike Plus for the first time. So she was out for a run, listening to music on her iPod, and she came to the end of the run, and at the end of the run, Paula Radcliffe came on her speakers, the famous athlete came on her speakers, congratulating her on the run. And I said, well, that's a nice story, and you got this little moment of surprise, and you were delighted. And that's nice. Interesting, because all of the other stories I've gathered, people were anxious about something. And she said, oh, I was anxious. I was worried about whether I'd make the time for my run, whether I'd be fast enough. And right at the end of the run, there was a little 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then Paula Radcliffe came on. So wait a minute. Nike are actually enhancing that feeling of anxiety. Oh, and then ending it surprisingly, and that leads to delight. Now, as user experience designers, we ought to be able to play with emotion. I'm not suggesting that if you're designing an online bank, you ought to do this sort of thing. Is your transaction going through? Ooh, yes! No. But if it's a playful experience like this, then why not play with people's emotions? So what's going on here? Why is there a difference between the things that the designers picked out and the things that users picked out? In his book, Emotional Design, Donald Norman gives a nice kind of model that you can play with to understand what's going on. He says you can think of the brain as having sort of different layers. So there's the visceral layer, okay, which is about touch and reflex. And then you've got the behavioral layer, which is about learned and instinctive behaviors. And then you've got the reflective layer, which is about thinking and evaluating. Each of those is able to elicit an emotion. Each of those is useful to us as designers. So if you think about that visceral layer, okay, you might have a product like this. It's an OXO potato peeler. So that potato peeler costs about $10. What is that? About 30 lira, something like that. That's an expensive potato peeler. And why would you spend so much money on a potato peeler? Well, when you pick it up, it feels nice. And that visceral feeling of pleasure means you think, yeah, that's worth it. Then the behavioral layer. These are the seat controls, the seat adjustment controls for a Mercedes. And you see they're laid out exactly like the seat. So this is pleasurable because you feel in control of what's going on. You're not having to work it out. And then there's a product like this. This is a digital watch. It's a binary digital watch. So my friend Kevlin, who's a computer programmer, would find this sort of thing hilarious. Okay? And it's pleasurable because it's witty. So each of those layers is something we can use to elicit emotion. And each of those is capable of delivering a delightful experience. When you think about the experiences that the people pulled out, they were all on that behavioral level. Okay? The visceral level, well, that's really hard to explain. And for us as designers, as interaction designers, it's quite hard to give people that sensation. Maybe one day with haptic feedback we'll get there, but at the moment not. And the reflective level, that was the stuff that the designers were pulling out. They were pulling out ideas that were witty or clever or unusual. The ones that people valued were the behavioral ones. They were the ones where there was a story to tell about something you did and a point behind it. Now, there's some value to that. I mean, if people are talking about your company, if people are sharing stories about delight, that's worth something. That's word-of-mouth marketing. So suddenly, it's not hard to prove the value of delight. And it shouldn't be a small moment. And yes, you can spend extra time doing it because you know it's worth value. You don't even have to worry about negative ROI, whatever that means. All you need is a story that's worth sharing. And those behavioral moments are the ones that count. And of course, you can measure that. Companies measure this all the time through customer satisfaction surveys, through Net Promoter Score. You can go on to discussion forums and see whether people are saying nice things about you or bad things about you. You can check Twitter and social media. There are all sorts of ways that you can measure whether people are delighted, whether you've got that good word-of-mouth marketing. And you should. Okay, but wait a minute. There's this odd thing. What about that feeling of anxiety that preceded the behavioral moment, the behavioral resolution? What's going on there? Do you have to feel anxiety before you can experience delight? Actually, I think it's something rather different. And it's an old technique which has been used for a very long time. Here's an advertisement from the 1960s which uses this technique.
This little box has been built with union carbide super insulation, which isn't much to look at. The put it in a container in a freezer and take it out a month later, and it would still be hot. If you don't think it's as good as we say it is, watch the movie.
Phew. They're lunatics, right? Why would anyone do that? Were you anxious? That guy is talking and talking and talking, and all you're thinking is, get the damn bird out of the water. And then he stops talking, and you're like, okay? And then he doesn't get the bird out of the water. What's going on? Well, it turns out that when you experience stress, you remember stuff better. If you inject mice with stress hormones and teach them a route round a maze, they remember it better. And this advert is trying to make you feel stressed, not so you'll remember all that stuff about whether you can keep your coffee hot in the freezer, but so you'll remember what a great insulator this was. And you do. So it's a technique that's been used for a long time, and I think that's why anxiety is important in these stories. If you can find a moment that people are anxious about, then you know that they're going to be experiencing stress, you know that they'll remember the great design work you did, and you know that they'll share the story. Now, I'm not saying that designs that are cute or clever aren't delightful. Of course they are. But it's a matter of taste, whether or not you find something like this delightful. And not everyone will. But here's a model that you can use, and it works every time. You can use it reliably to figure out how to delight customers. So here's what I do. When I'm thinking about redesigning an experience, first of all, I map out all of the tasks that people have to go through in that experience. And then I think about all of the things that they do to complete those tasks. And then I think about all of the things that my client's website does, or app does, or the competitors' websites do. I think about all of those things. By the way, this technique, you can read about it in a book by a woman called Indy Young. The book's called Mental Models. It's one of my favorite books about user experience. When I've created a map like this, what I go looking for are moments where everybody gets it wrong. A moment where my client gets it wrong, a moment where all the competitor designs get it wrong. Because I know that when people get to that moment, they'll be anxious. They'll be like, oh no, choose a password. I hate this. And if I can find a way of fixing that, I know I'll create delight. My final point is that over time, delight fades. So what's wow and delightful today becomes love and then just like over time. People get used to it, which means that you constantly need to find those moments of failure and constantly need to fix them, which is good. It means you're always going to be in a job. So, I've got my rules and I've got my measures. Look for points of anxiety, experienced anxiety or remembered anxiety. If appropriate, you can play with that and enhance that feeling. Pick just one and fix it completely. There's no point in half fixing it. You've got to resolve it effortlessly. Or in a way that's personal or clever or superior. You can measure the improvements through user tests and look at word of mouth. And remember, delight fades away, so don't get cocky. Always be improving. And if you do those things, I guarantee you will delight your customers. Thank you.